All right, we're now officially recording. So Dr. Lewis Stern was introduced to me by Lillian Abrams. And so there's this whole movement of supervision, coaching supervision happening on the East Coast that's been around as well. So it's nice to tap into this group. He's here to present on the dynamic complexity of a 4D model of coaching supervision. And I went, what? So here we are, excited to hear what that's all about. For participants, this will be an interactive session, and I would also encourage you to use the chat room, and I'll be monitoring that on behalf of Dr. Lewis. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you all, or for you to see me. Although this is going to be a bit of a formal presentation at the beginning, just to get things on the table, at any point, please talk into the chat room. And as Lily monitors, as any questions come up, she's going to interrupt me. This is going to be rather informal as we go. I have prepared formal notes. So as you see me looking down, that's what it's about, looking at my notes. Please excuse. As much as possible, I'm going to be looking for interaction. So feel free just to interrupt anytime you can with the chat room, and then Lily will open us up. I've had the privilege of doing coaching and supervision with coaches for about 40 years before we called it coaching. And I call it a privilege because I've had a really good time, and I feel very lucky to be in this profession, as I'm sure many of you have. Supervision, I find the funniest thing about supervision is that it's like love. It means so many different things to different people at different times. And so, and yet many of us assume that when we say supervision of coaching, we know what we mean. And we probably do, but no one else does. So I'm not going to make any assumptions today about what it is, but I'm going to start sharing some slides and just start talking, and we'll see where it goes. Lily's going to help me with our technology here. All right, can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
We're good. All
You're
right.
like a pro.
All right. So the complexity I'm talking about to begin with is a relationship complexity. And I know all of you know this, but just to remind us all, and that is that we're not just talking about the relationship between us and the people we supervise, but their relationship with the people they coach, and the relationship between the people they coach and the people with whom they work and live, and then the relationship between all of that and the organization or community in which they work. So, and the interesting thing is, as a supervisor, as all you know, we have very little power and often no influence over any of that. And yet we're trying to have influence over the capabilities and the effectiveness of the people we're supervising. And depending upon that contract, the influence either is significant or very little, even when it comes to the ability of the person to be successful in their coaching. So let me go to the next slide. This is simply the layers, and depending upon where you are and when you are in a coaching supervision session, there's just so much going on, right? And it's fascinating to step back and always, I guess you'll get as a theme for what I'm going to be talking about today, is that we can get an autopilot. And we're just assuming that we know what's going on and that we do what we always do, especially when we're under stress or we're tired or whatever it is. And we tend to supervise the way we tend to supervise. And just, there's so much going on here that we need to really peel it back. And I'm going to encourage everyone to do that. But just as in jazz, if you can stay open to improvisation and stay open to the possibility that you might need to do something completely different than what you might normally do, and listen to the music, if you will, the music between you and the person you're with. And it's the wonders of that chaos, if you will, of the supervision. And this morning I'm going to provide a perspective on how to supervise in the chaos, and talk about a three-dimensional model of supervision. Originally, I put it down as a four-dimensional, and I found that the 4 dimensions, you can have a 20-dimensional model, but 3 is going to be easier for us to handle this morning, and I'll add some others as we go. So a colleague of mine often uses the quote that, it's a wonderful expression, that a coach's role is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And And you know what that means is that the person you're with may be very comfortable in what they're doing, and our job is to afflict them, and not negatively afflict them, but to sort of push them and hold up the mirror and let them feel a little bit discomfort, and so they can lean into that discomfort. On the other hand, there are people who are very insecure, very uncomfortable, very worried about what they're doing. And our job for them, and we have to sense this as to where we are at any time in the balance between the two, is to know what to do at that very moment. So many of you might know that the origin of the word coach is from Kos, which is in Hungary. In the 15th century, they had uncovered wagons, and they hadn't invented yet the covered wagon or the using shocks. So when people went for rides, which obviously there were no cars back then, the ride was rather dirty and rather uncomfortable. And so in Kos, they invented the coach so that people would get less dirty and have less injuries as a result of moving from one point to another. And it was very interesting that it was not until the 19th century, end of the 19th century, before they started to use that term from the vehicle to a person who helps someone get from point A to point B. And that's the origin of our use of coaching and our supervision of coaching. So given that that's the case, it's not until the late 20th century before we started using it in this term, in this way. But I think it's important to use remember that history as we think about what is our role. And our role is to provide those shocks and provide that comfort and provide the safety so that people can be vulnerable. And yet we need to not go on autopilot, as I said before. So I'd like you to consider the autonomous supervisor, okay? I have a friend, Roger, who is a brilliant physician and a social activist. And he has an autonomous driving car, and they are out there. And when he wants, he can get into the driver's seat on Cape Cod, where I am, and tell the car's computer, just verbally, that he wants to go to the State House in Boston. And the car drives on its own, and he just sits there until he gets there. He can take it off if he wants, if he's more comfortable. More often, he doesn't activate the autonomous supervision, this autonomous driving, okay? But many of us do that same thing. We go on to autonomous supervision. We go into what we would normally do and do what we're comfortable doing. But when life gets a little bit stressful as a supervisor, and today what isn't stressful, given what's going on in the world, what's going on in our country, what's going on around the world, everywhere, and the stress of work that we're dealing with people, the complexity of the markets, it's very easy to get pulled in to try to be more comfortable in that autopilot role, autopilot place. And in those places, you know, what do we do when we get stressed? We go into our doing things that are like watching TV or eating comfort foods. And when we're supervisors, what do? If we tend to be people with a psychological background, we focus on the psychological as opposed to the social or the interpersonal. If we tend to be people with organizational backgrounds, we focus on organizational dynamics. If we tend to be people who are more introverted, we focus on our own thoughts. If we tend to be people who are more extroverted, we tend to teach and push and sell and influence. So I'd like to describe two coaches that I've supervised to get us to consider how we might not allow ourselves to get pulled into the auto drive and really be very mindful about our supervision. And I know that everyone talks about mindfulness, but today what I'd like to think is, how do we do that? And what are our personal habits and circumstances that we tend to do that? And how can we stop ourselves from just too often going on auto drive instead of really tailoring what we do to the people we work with? And the first person I'm going to talk about is Mariana. And pardon me as I read this, I don't want to miss anything. Mariana was an internal coach and human resource function of an international marketing division of a very large global high-tech company. And she came from a staunch, Catholic, wealthy Central American family. She was in her late 20s and had just been promoted to a management role where she would be coaching executives in the US, the Middle East, and Western Europe. She had a strong HR background that was relatively new to coaching. Her immediate need was supervision in beginning to coach the 3 senior executives she was about to support in her HR role as manager. She had difficulties with her boss and lacked confidence. She was extremely motivated to build her coaching skills and succeed in her new role. Her boss was highly experienced as an SVP of HR for the division. I had coached him in the past. He had big hopes for Mariana, but also had some concerns about her initial lack of confidence to push back on him and the individual execs and teams with whom she worked. He wanted me to supervise her, and she was very receptive and open to our work together. She was naturally talented and a compassionate coach. We're going to get asked the question, what would you tend to do with Mariana? How would you think about that coaching? What style would you do? What would be the content of your supervision with her? What do you think the goals might look like more specifically? How would you approach implementing those goals? But before we go there, I'm going to talk about a second person who's very, very different, a very different background and a very different context. And then we're going to step into asking questions about how might you think about this and what might you be inclined to go on autopilot for and do what you might do normally in your own style with your own approach. The second person is Max. So Max is a psychiatrist who grew up in the military family, originally from the Midwest of the United States, but he had lived all over the world. Max had served as a therapist and a manager of a psychiatry department of a major hospital. He had recently left his position and was coaching physicians and senior leaders in healthcare and biotech, as well as academia. He asked me to supervise him to help him further adjust his style from therapeutic and managerial to developmental. He was energetic, funny, and extremely bright, but he tended to view all coaching interactions from a diagnostic and treatment perspective, more clinical. He understood the coach approach in his head, but needed to internalize it and incorporate it into his coaching technique and style. He also wanted help to expand and market his new practice as an independent coach with me as his supervisor. Interesting? So, as we think about this model that I'm going to ask you to apply to these 2 people and other people with whom you work, here are the 3 dimensions that we're going to start with this 3D model. And when I talk about a model, we're talking about how do you decide what to do with the person? And here are 3 factors to consider in a 3D model. In other words, when we talk about the experience level characteristics and needs of the person you're supervising, and then the agreed upon purpose and goals of the supervision, and finally the systemic context within which the supervision is taking place at any time within the supervision. So all of those can go onto a model that we're going to be looking at, where you can look at, for example, a novice coach who is focusing on developing a new skill of listening, or perhaps they're focusing on understanding the organization that they're working with. But perhaps the context that we're focusing on today has to do with the change that's going on in that organization and the pressure that they're getting from their boss. How do we take all of those 3 times 3 times 3 or 27 different boxes into effect? So that's only 3 dimensions, but here are some others. I'm not trying to limit you in any way. So some other potential dimensions here, for example, your experience and capabilities as a supervisor, or your theoretical approach to coaching and supervision. What if you're more psychoanalytic or more eclectic or more behavioral? And then the culture and the language within which you're operating. So dealing with Montreal or with Latin America or with Russia or Israel, all of those cultures, whether or not a person comes from a traditional background or they're younger and they have a real kind of laissez-faire kind of approach. Finally, the time horizon of the supervision. So is this a 1-month event or a 2-year event? that we're talking about for supervision? Is it we're going to start out for a short time and go to a long? And finally, the type of coaching for which you're supervising. Is it someone who does ADHD coaching, or someone who does strictly executive coaching, or someone who does interpersonal coaching or marriage coaching? So all of those things will obviously have an impact on what you're going to do and when you do it. So what are the benefits of not working on autopilot? I'm not going to read through all these, but they're sort of obvious. But on the other hand, do you really think about these things? Are you truly open-minded when you're in a coaching session? Are you aware? Are you attentive to the body language, to the tone, to what the person is talking about, to how the atmosphere is changing during a session? Are you aware to what went on in the organization if they work in an organization as an executive? Are you checking in on the pressure in the business environment? How about being more client-focused and showing greater compassion? Obviously, there's an enormous amount of research in the last few years on the impact of compassion on a person's ability to feel good about themselves, on their openness, on their confidence level, on just going into their sympathetic or non-sympathetic system and their ability to function and process information. So any of these things will be positively influenced by your being out of autopilot and being responsive and open. Second, consider the stages of supervision. So going into autopilot can happen at any one of these stages. So you could do it as you're doing pre-supervision, needs analysis, and planning. Do you have one way of doing that? Do you tend to give out a questionnaire to your supervisees to find out where they're at? What about maybe not doing that this time because it's not going to be best for the person you're working with? I'm supervising a blind person right now. A questionnaire not as good as perhaps an interaction. Contracting, you could get stuck in the way that you contract with people. Do you have a standard contract that you use? Do you have a standard way of meeting with a person's supervisory management team if they work in an organization? How about doing data gathering? Do you do assessment and analysis? Are there certain assessment tools that you use, and maybe you shouldn't be using them in this situation or not doing any assessment? Goal setting, supervision, upfront, measuring, any of these things, you might have your own way of doing it and one way of doing it. And all I'm encouraging us to do at this point is to step back and not do it one way. And even if you're tired or stressed or the person you're working with is having difficulties, how can you force yourself to always be and then pull yourself out of autopilot when it's appropriate? So here's the 3D model, and after we walk through this, I'm going to ask us to apply this to the two cases that I brought up, Mariana and Max. But before I do that, let me turn to you and see what kinds of questions and comments you have.
So Lou, there's one question from Lillian, which is what types of coaches you primarily supervise?
I supervise primarily executive coaches.
Thanks. Okay, anybody have any questions? Comments, thoughts? All right, y'all making a liar out of me because I told Lou that you were very interactive and full of questions. Michael Cullen says, all valid points.
Okay. Is there anything new here for you? One at a time now.
No, I was going to say that this is Amanda. This is a fabulous model. I love to see it really well laid out like this. This is so, I want to just wrap my head around this. So thank you for sharing this.
Oh, sure.
This is Michael. For me, so far, all the coaches that I've been supervising, it's a question of actually introducing them to this whole concept of supervision and its purpose and its goals and how they're adapting to it. And each one is adapting to it in a very different manner, which is absolutely fascinating. So there is no autopilot at this point, which is somewhat vexing when you want to be of service. Sometimes it's a question of just being so receptive that I find the supervision in that sense can be very passive.
On your part as well?
No, my mind is churning a million miles a minute, I think, in that sense. I'm constantly evaluating where they are, where they want to be, what is it that they're looking for that perhaps they have trouble articulating,
Yeah.
or putting things into context. Invariably, I find so far, I am new to this, that it's definitely more about them than it is about their clients or the organization, although that influences a lot of how they go about doing what they're doing. Their agendas seem to be set by office politics or expectations, and compromising and going into gray zones of ethics.
Yeah. And, you know, the balance act that I was talking about before, when you have a new person who's never been through supervision and is new to coaching, it's rather exhausting because everything is possible and you have to just tailor everything. So I'm not suggesting that you never be on autopilot, because you need it to not burn out. If you have 10 new clients who've never been supervised before and they've never coached before, just getting started is exhausting. A lot of people I know have 20, 25 people that they supervise at once, and many of them are new, and it's exhausting. So it's the balancing act of having certain things that you do a certain way and not getting stuck in those if they don't work the way you want them to.
Okay, so we have a couple of comments, Lou. Kathy Ryan, the potential benefits of being more mindful supervision off of autopilot would also apply to being a coach. John Hoover says, glad to hear the systems focus. And Kimsey says, I'd like to hear more about the model.
Okay.
And I think as a new supervisor in training, there's no autopilot, but could see how easily it is to get lost in all the processing. Is from Larissa.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to Larissa's comment of saying, I think it's true as a new supervisor, you're not yet in so many habits that you have to then jolt yourself out of to be mindful and to break them. It did occur to me to wonder that if one is working with internal coaches more, it's just a thought. I don't know if it's true or not. If they have I don't know the answer to this, if there are more specified processes that they have to follow, that as a supervisor, then you might have to be more mindful, because, you know, if we're mirroring our client that way, that might be a situation that brings up more of a need to remind ourselves to be mindful and not be in autopilot.
Yes. And just to make a comment about supervising internal coaches, many of you might be able to identify with this who do that. Many organizations, as you know, have internal processes that make no sense whatsoever and inhibit them from working effectively with their clients. So I find it very, very important to have a partnership with the person who's managing the internal coaching so that you can push back and work with them to say, do the internal processes really make sense? Is it going to work in the situation that they're working in? There's just too many times that I've worked where a person is held back from doing the right thing with their clients.
What I want to say that I am very interested in this distinction between supervising a novice, a moderate, and expert coach. I think we have not, with many of the colleagues here who have gone through my program or currently my program, we never had that kind of conversation. And I do see a lot of value in exploring what will be the differences.
Yes. And you know what, whether or not a person talks about things in a level of complexity, assuming that a person knows something or doesn't know something, and whether or not you're refining a skill or changing assumptions, challenging assumptions, you're really, with a person who's an expert, you're dealing as much with the difficulty of a person who goes on autopilot themselves way too often. And you're having to break habits. As a person, a novice who tends to be pretty open, unless they're coming into this and they have a personality to begin with that is rather stubborn and likes to structure things in their own way and control. You know, it's not, what do you do with a person who has a high need for control who's an expert? You know, it's very difficult to supervise them, especially in a complex system. So, yeah, should I jump into the model and then?
Yeah, a couple more comments and then let's jump into the model, shall we?
Okay, sure.
So, Nancy, I'd rather say that instead of being on autopilot, we get present to what's happening in the room when we're faced with a lot of new supervisees. And
Yeah.
Maria Teresa, being versatile is very important because every encounter is different. Each client is a whole world. And Mary Jo, I find myself sometimes getting caught up in the dilemma and situation that my supervisee is describing to me and have to remind myself, remind myself to get back to the person I'm supervising. Leanne Lowish, I appreciate the reminder about going on autopilot. And then Lillian has a comment to Damien about the stages of development as a coach.
Yes.
All right.
So before I get into this, I just want to mention one of the things that people often do is they try to be everything to everyone, and when they start coming up with a strategy for their own supervision practice or their coaching practice.
Sorry, we have somebody isn't on mute. Sorry.
Thanks, guys.
Quiero comprar un boleto. Yo estoy usando mis niñas para mi nieta.
Te estamos escuchando. Si por favor puedes ponerte en silencio. Gracias.
Para Seattle, yo tengo las fechas.
No.
Y a Seattle, Washington. Ajá, no. Sería el domingo 11 a Seattle.
One of the telephones, I think you can mute it yourself. Either 1214-236-1117, you can mute that phone yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that.
One of the telephone 1214-236-1117.
1117.
Austin. ¿Cómo se llama? Y de Austin a Seattle el 11 de marzo.
Did you find it?
No.
Mis puntos.
It's one of the phone. It's one of the phones only. It's the first phone after your name is coming up.
No sé si se puede aplicar Miguel Rey.
Oh, I see it. Mute. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, guys. So I don't know about you, but one of the things that a lot of people do is, with me as a supervisor, they're looking to me to help them focus their practice of coaching. And that may be just because I do a lot of that professionally anyway. But when I ran a coach certification program for years, a lot of people were trying to decide whether or not they were going to focus on one kind of client or many clients. And the more that they try to do too much, they need a larger repertoire of skills and knowledge. So if they're going to try to do every kind of coaching with every kind of client in every kind of setting, then they're going to have to know a heck of a lot and be good and have a repertoire to be able to shift from one thing to another. And one of the things I find that's most helpful is that if we can say, start small and grow, but don't try to be everything to everyone at the beginning. And I think when you look at this model, you'll see that it's just impossible to do all that. And when you try to go on autopilot, you're going on 10 autopilots at once. So let me just jump into the model. I know this is rather self-explanatory, and I'll see what questions you have. And you'll find this model or something very similar to it in a book that I co-wrote a chapter on coaching supervision. And the book is Supervision in the Psychological Professions. And the chapter is 2 other people and myself. And you can get it on Amazon. It's available. It's on all psychological professions, coaching being one of them. And this one is on coaching supervision. So again, I think several of you already mentioned that there's the novice, moderate, and expert. So as you think about this to begin with, ask yourself, where is this person? And remember that this is, again, a pretty standard thing, but no one is a novice on everything. But when you're dealing with a certain situation, they may be a novice in dealing with that situation. They may be a brand new coach, but they may have a lot of experience in working in a particular situation. So then what you need to focus on is that they're an expert in the topic, but they're a novice on the process. So this is not just novice or expert overall, but novice or expert on what along that continuum. Does that make sense? Okay, I see some nodding heads. So then when you move up here on the left side, you'll see dealing with individual, interpersonal, or systemic issues. So one is, for example, dealing with the individual having to focus on their micro skills. So the individual focusing on their interpersonal skills, their ability to listen to other people. On the interpersonal, this is perspective taking. So it's focusing not on them and what they do, but whether or not they focus on the dynamics going on between them and other people. And then noticing systemic processes. This is basically where are you going to talk, where are you going to focus in your supervision with the person? So are you going to deal with a novice person who's focusing on whether or not they're able to listen, or a novice person focusing on what's going on in the system? And then are you going to deal with them looking on the top around skill building? So are you going to focus on actually practicing with them, or role modeling with them, or giving them feedback on their ability to actually use eye contact or to use open-ended questions? Or are you going to fix or enhance something that they already do, but not as well as they might do it? So it's not building a foundation of skills through training and feedback, but giving more very specific cognitive, behavioral, observational feedback to adjust something with them. So to help them be aware of what they're doing that could be done differently. And or it could be to explore assumptions and innovate to help them do that. And that is to not just focus on what they're doing and get better at it, or to build it as a brand new skill, but maybe to challenge whether or not what they're doing is the right thing to do to begin with. And that's challenging and further understanding by exploring the assumptions. So as you go across here, are you focusing on a novice person who needs training and feedback, or a moderate person who needs to support habit formation or change, or an expert person looking along the top close box on extending the range of their skills and adding something to their repertoire? If you take, for example, a novice person who's focusing at the individual level around adapting and improving, what are you going to talk about there? What would you be doing? And we'll talk about Maria, for example. So we'll talk about where she might be. So if I was to talk with Maria, who's a novice coach, she's an expert in HR, but she's a novice coach. And we're talking about perspective taking with her 3 execs and their teams. And is it going to be to fix or enhance? In most cases for her, it's going to be giving her some training and feedback about what she would do in perspective taking, helping to understand the dynamics of what's going on either between her and the people she's working with, or between members of the team. As opposed to an expert, imagine that you're working with a person who has 10 years experience as an executive coach or as a relationship coach. Let me just ask this question. Lily, are most of the people here also executive coaches? Do they work in organizations, or do they have other perspectives?
Yes, generally, yes.
Okay, thank you. So imagine having someone who has a PhD or master's degree, who's been working for 10 years, either externally or internal to an organization. They worked with very complex cases, and they're now being asked to expand their role and work more at a senior role with the CEO or the CEO's team, or around a major restructuring of an organization, or working with customers and how a person can change their marketing strategy. So working with that expert, and you're talking about the interpersonal level, having to do with the systemic levels, interpersonal, provoking group reflection and dialogue. So how are you going to be helping that person provoking group reflection and dialogue within the teams that they're working, or seek some alternative responses? And so you'd be asking them and ask questions. What else might you do here? What have you seen any of your peers be doing? Or challenge some assumptions and frames at the systemic level around influences systemic change. So what you might be doing is to explore assumptions around the system and really pushing and saying something like, I think you're missing something here. Have you thought about what you might do to force the organization to rethink how they're structured? What could you do to make that happen? You know the options. How would you make that happen? Okay? So I know it's very easy to try to get into 27 boxes and to say, how would this work? Let me go down first to these cases so you can get something. I'm going to ask some questions. Consider the people that with whom you're working, not only her and him, but also the people you're working with, and put yourself into any of the many boxes on the model, and then ask yourself, how would this change your approach, your speed, your direction, your skills, your techniques? Either at any of those 9 stages. How about at the beginning when you're just assessing how you're going to do the coaching, or contracting, or doing some evaluation, or doing feedback, or actually having a supervision session, or reassessing how it's going. So we're not just talking about during the session, but any of the places along the process of coaching and supervision. So let's talk about excuse me. All right. In my first supervision session with Mariana, we explored coaching as a part of her role as an HR manager for her executive clients and their teams. I learned that she never coached any senior leader, and in fact, had only coached individual employees to address their personal performance issues. On autopilot, I would have focused on the organizational issues the leaders and their teams were facing and how she might help them with those issues. Then I would help her become more aware of the knowledge and skills she would need to develop to coach them and help to build those competencies. When I came off the task-focused auto drive, I slowed down when I listened to her and saw a sadness and fear. I needed to really stop. And with a little bit of quiet and a couple open-ended questions, we uncovered issues of abuse in her marriage and how it was affecting her confidence to deal with men in power at work. As part of supervision, I referred her to psychotherapy. We followed up on her slow progression to a divorce and helped her to be confident and assertive with men at the work in positive ways. It completely turned around what we were doing, but I really needed to get off my task-focused autopilot. Okay, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have done that, I don't know. But what I needed to do sometimes, we all need to do, is to just slow down, be aware of everything going around you, not only the words, the tone, the body language, but also some of the organizational context that you're picking up as you're staying in touch with what's going on at their company, or with the technology, or a phone conversation that you have with their boss, or a phone conversation you have with what's going on in HR, or what's going on in that division, or how about that part of the world that she's working with. So as we're doing this, we need to use all of that information to help to inform whether or not we can go where we'd normally go, or step back and see if we should do something else. Let me stop there and see what questions you have and comments you have and how you might use this.
Okay, so we'll open the floor up for people to actually speak, so I don't need to track the chat. So feel free to step into this, and I'm just doing a time check. I think we have about 15 minutes left.
It just strikes me that this is getting back to coaching the person and not the challenge or the goal per se.
Yeah. And if we look at the recent research about goal-focused coaching and supervision, it's showing us that it will work perhaps for 6 months, but will not sustain itself beyond that. So we need to go more person-focused and more vision-focused as opposed to focus on goals.
There are a couple of questions here in the chat room. Well, we invite people to ask them, but since Barbara brought it down here, is what brings you to the subject of her in marriage in the first session? What questions and observations? And Kathy asked, do you have sample questions that might accompany this model?
Well, you know, it's just basic. I use what's called a funneling technique that I put together years ago. It's just good active listening. You know, you start with an open-ended question, repeat what the person says, encourage them to tell you more, have some silence. Don't add anything until you're sure that there's something of value to add. And then once you've done that, go right back up to the top if there's a new topic to be discussed. In this case, it was very simple. I said, hi, how you doing? And she said, okay. how was your weekend? Or actually, what I should have said if I didn't say it is, okay, tell me more. And then, you say, tell me more. And she says, well, it was okay. I said, well, what do you mean okay? And she said, well, I'm going through a tough time. Silence. And then she started to tear up. So, you tear up. I don't want to push. You all right? Yeah, stuff's going on at home. Is that something you want to talk about, or is it affecting work? How are things going? Quiet, reflective, slow it down, more silence, encourage her. How is this affecting you? And just, to move from that task focus to maintenance focus, very important. Always go back in the loop. I don't know about you guys, I'm very fast. My pace is way too fast for most of my clients. So I have to very forcibly slow down. I've learned to do that, but when I'm stressed, I go on autopilot and I'm going way too fast and I zoom right by the client and it doesn't work. I'm also too psychological at times, because that's my background. So I need to get off autopilot on being too psychological and talk more something else, whether it be a sociological or practical or technology or something else. If I'm working with an IT guy, I need to stop talking about how you're feeling and start talking about how's the system going, just the language we use, the cultural norms. I'm sure many of you are aware of the original work done, Influence Without Authority, where you need to use language that's much more in sync with the person and use that to frame the questions that we're asking. So you need to find out what language they're comfortable, what they're used to by all their cultural norms, their personal cultural norms from growing up. So the questions that you ask about here, the questions to me are formed based on what you know about the person. If you don't take time to know about the person, their relationships, their organization, their coaching, then you don't know what questions to ask. They're tailored to the individual. I'll give a couple examples. For example, facilitating group learning. So under a moderate interpersonal, okay? Facilitating group learning by support-aware practice. So how do we do that? So you might ask, the question is, can you tell me when you were in that meeting, what happened? And was there something that you did that either helped or hindered that from moving further? If you were to think about the people that you know who do that really well, as a coach, as a facilitator, what do they do? How might you incorporate that in with this team? And if I find that the person looks a little bit uncomfortable, they don't seem to know what they're doing, I said, should we step back for a second and talk about group dynamics? Tell me what you know about this group and what their dynamics are and how you might be able to intervene with them as their group coach. And then what I do is, if I'm working with someone telecommuting with them, I have available to me thousands of documents that I prepared in the past about every possible subject in the world. And I simply send it to them immediately and we look at it together. So it might be about conflict resolution, it may be about trust building, it may be about interpersonal bias. And we simply look at that only as a model to have language to talk about what's going on and to apply it to what they're doing. The same thing, those documents are also around every kind of coaching competency, and I can pull them up. If I'm with them one-on-one, then I have all those available to me on my laptop, and we can pull them up and simply, again, send it to them where they are. Other comments and questions?
Well, this is John Hoover, and I think the framework is very, very helpful. But of course, curiosity probably informs the questions, and the model you have can categorize the questions.
Yes. It's more, what it does to me and to other people that I've talked with about this, it forces you to not get stuck on a channel. You know, when you brainstorm, you get stuck on channeling, and you ask, tell me all the kinds of birds you know, and a person will come up with chicken, and then come up with a rooster, and come up with all barn birds. But what about birds like Larry Bird? And what about peacocks? And what about hawks? So you need to always force yourself to get off the channel you're in and get into another channel. This allows you to use your remote control and check your guide to see what's playing and whether or not you're right on the right channel.
Interesting you'd add the Celtics channel, being a Harvard guy.
Other comments and questions? Let me go down to talk about what happened with Max. A very different case, okay? So in my first supervision session with Max, he completed a coaching competency evaluation. He asked for it because he was aware of it. This is a competency model that was put together back in the early 2000s by the Executive Coaching Forum. If you haven't seen it, it's worth looking at. I've been part of that group and a leader of that group for many years. It's available at theexecutivecoachingforum.com. And it has a very complex, multifaceted competency model, and it allows you to think about at the novice level, the moderate level, the expert level, and then it also has a self-evaluation and another evaluation available. So it allows a person to do that. Well, this Max was aware of that, and he filled it out before he came in, and then so he shared that with me, and asked some of the closer colleagues to evaluate him of his greatest coaching strengths and opportunities for improvement. So when he shared his perspective, I said, do you know how other people view you? And he said, not really. I said, well, you can use the other form to do that. So we identified the greatest need for supervision in the areas of understanding organizational complexities and going beyond reflective listening. He was very good at reflective diagnostic, clinical kinds of stuff. He's, psychiatrist. He had that thing going, psychoanalytic base. He was also very hung up on building a website to market his coaching practice to all business markets rather than networking and targeting his marketing strategies to organizations and functions where he would be appreciated for his background. On autopilot, I would have spent a lot of time tutoring him on organizational dynamics and networking. But when I stepped back and explored the situation with my peer supervisors, I was in a peer supervision group at the time, I held back from more didactic and skill development supervision and helped him identify which clients he was seeing that really benefited from his strengths and guided him through the building of a marketing strategy that leveraged his contacts. And those were in healthcare, biotech, and universities, where he had strong contacts. So again, would I have done that? I'm not sure. All I did is, in looking at this and asking, am I focusing? He's a novice when it comes to marketing. He's a novice when it comes to working in organizations outside of a manager role. But he's an expert when it comes to good listening skills, but he's not an expert in getting out of the clinical approach to coaching and using one that's more systemic. So how do I force myself to question those things and allow him to pull it into the right direction? What would you do with a person like Max? How might you have done something completely different or similar? How about someone else that you're working with that you'd like to bring up to people, knowing this is a public session, that maybe we could talk about and think about this model as to what would you do to either stay in autopilot or get off? I think I've just overwhelmed you all. Either that or it's so obvious that there's nothing to be said.
So Lou, this is Ann Boyum, and I'm curious how much Max informed your understanding of his novice levels. Like, was that something that the two of you dialogued about, or was that an interpretation that you took and worked through this model on your own?
I have sort of a supervision intake form that helps me go through the basic competency levels of coaching. and ask him to give me descriptions of what he's done and how he does it, to help us together to evaluate how much of a novice he is in different areas.
So I'm really hearing that there's a partnership where he is in agreement that he wants to zero in on the marketing, or he's in agreement that he doesn't understand organizational complexities.
Yes, absolutely. But you know, the trouble is that we can limit the number of questions that we ask, so that we ask him whether or not he's an expert in an area that he wouldn't have even thought about, or not ask him whether or not he's an expert in the area that he is thinking about. So we have to be careful not to limit that by going on autopilot, by saying things that we think are important that he may not, or the other way around.
Do you share this model with somebody like Max, but maybe not Mariana?
I share it with everyone and ask them to. I think you raise a good question, because a novice could get overwhelmed with the model, with the competency model. So you do have to be careful about that, in which case I frame it up front to say, look, you're at the beginning, and over the next 10 years, you could get really good at this gradually, and you're going to deal with more and more complex situations the further you go. But to begin with, you can be a really good coach. Let's focus on those areas where you can leverage your strengths and your experience and your knowledge, and then add some things as you go. And you give them the model and say, where should we focus on? Where are you really good? And where could you use development over the next year or so?
Lu, we have 2 minutes to wrap up, so I wonder if there is anything you want to say before we finish today.
Well, let's see if there's anything that I wrote down that I haven't talked about. I guess this is obvious here. Ask whether or not you should have this balance of autopilot or be disengaged. You're trying to work out whether or not you're exhausted and you're offering the most you can to the client in the situation and the moment that you're in, while at the same time being able to improvise. You can ask a jazz player, you have to be aware and very alert. Are any of you jazz musicians? I play the piano. And as I play the piano, if you're playing with other players in jazz, it's very different than working off of a score where you just have to play your notes. When you're improvising, you really have to be connected, and it can be exhausting. So there are times to go on autopilot where you just do what comes naturally. And there are other times where you have to come off. And by balancing that, you can make sure that you're giving your most that's tailored to the individual. I hope the model was somehow helpful to just think about that and be aware of it. Thanks all for the time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It was great having you today with us. And for people who are joining us for first time, our goal with Lily, with this network, is to provide opportunity for coaching supervisors in the Americas to keep learning. Also to create a community of support where people can get to know each other and support each other in their practices as coach supervisors. But we also open this network to anybody who wants to join us and are interested in the topic of coaching supervision. Next month, we're going to be having as a guest speaker, Joel de Girolamo. He is one of the staff and researchers from ICF Global in the headquarters. He's going to be presenting the paper that they wrote last year around coaching supervision. And we are going to share that document with everybody who is interested, so you can read it before we have the meeting, and you may be able to ask any questions you may have for him. And Lily, do you want to briefly share also about the conference coming up?
Yep, just a reminder, the Coaching Supervision Conference in Victoria, BC. It is, I'm just checking because I keep forgetting the dates. April 19th and 20th. So there's a few tickets left. If you're interested, let me know.
Yeah, I think we're going to sold out the conference. We're very excited with Lily. So if you're planning about coming and you have not signed up yet, do it soon, because this is going to sold out.
Yes,
and
sure.
Yeah, and if anybody here is interested in presenting in the future, or you know somebody, like in this case, Lillian recommended Lu, that you think will be a good presenter for our network, we would really appreciate that. We're working with Lillian coming up with a website where we can put all of the videos and documents from these sessions. So thank you everybody for participating today. And Lu, thank you very much. Do you want to write down your in the chat room, your email if somebody wants to reach you and want to be in communication with you. I know that Lily, we're going to be sharing the slides, but to have that handy, if you want to write down in the chat room your email and website so people can reach you if they have any question or they want to be in communication with you, I think that can be good for everyone. Do you know, look how to do it in the chat room?
I'm going to do it in a minute. Yeah, let's see if I can figure it out. Chat, there we are.
Okay, good. So people can access to your website and be in touch with you.
Just make sure that you've got it to everyone, not just to one particular person.
Good question. Let's see. Everyone, thank you for reminding me.
And also, if somebody here comes here for first time and you were invited by one of our colleagues, we may not have you in our mailing list. So if that's the case, please reach Lily. Lily just wrote her email, and please send her your email so she can include in our mailing list. So that this is a request, please. If you can do that, we would really appreciate that.
And also, just as a reminder, Lily has a copy of all the slides and she can get them. Lily, how will you be getting slides to people?
Yeah, I'll send a follow-up email with a link to the recording as well as the slides until we get our website up and going.
All right.
Thank you everybody for participating.